Well, good evening and welcome, everyone. I'm Ivo Dollar, the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and it's great for all of you to be here, and particularly my pleasure to welcome Anne Applebaum, a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, author of Gulag and Iron Curtain, and now Famine, available not now, but immediately after the program over there. We'll be talking about the book tonight. It's superb. If you haven't read it, if you haven't bought it, do. It's well worth your time. Anne, of course, is not just a award-winning historian. She's also a columnist for the Washington Post and a professor at the London School of Economics, where she runs IRENA, a program on disinformation and 20th century propaganda.
21st century.
21st century, knowing what the 20th century did.
We're done with the 20th century.
So we can take that conversation and really work on that part, and I'm sure there will be a question or two about those kinds of issues. But we're going to really talk about the book before we start, though. A few housekeeping remarks. Of course, the views expressed on this panel by anybody are their own and cannot and should not be taken as the views of the council. We're on the record. We're live streaming. We are encouraging you to engage in social media. If you could do so with your phones on silence, that would be great. Later, of course, we'll take audience questions, and as usual, you can join us online through conference.io, which is chi.cnf.io, or you can get onto your browser and participate in that way as well. So we'll have some questions as we go around. Great. Wonderful, Anne, welcome.
Thank you very much.
I know you flew in all the way from London. Congratulations on the book. It really is, as I said, a terrific book. Let's start with the main topic, the famine. Where did it come from? What was it about? Who and what was responsible? Help us understand, for those who haven't read it and don't know their history as well, what was this famine that you decided to write about?
So the Ukrainian famine was a part of a larger famine. I actually begin the book in the autumn of 1932, when Stalin was looking at a moment of chaos. He had a few years earlier begun the process of collectivization, and that was really bringing the Bolshevik Revolution to the countryside for the first time, and it meant that he was evicting peasants from their homes, from their farms, and forcing them to join state farms. And the result of this, which was an enormous transformation in the countryside, was, first of all, a rebellion. Many people fought against it. They refused to move. In Ukraine in particular, but also elsewhere in the Soviet Union, people fought back violently at some times. They went into their barns, into their gardens, dug up the guns they'd had from the Civil War and started shooting back. Chaos led to other kinds of disorganization. The whole rural economy began to unravel. Distribution systems for grain weren't working. And yet at the same time, Stalin felt that because he'd done collectivization, there should be more grain and not less. And so he began increasing the grain requisitions and forcing peasants to hand over grain. Right at this moment, when chaos was mounting, when starvation was beginning, when food shortages were a problem all over the Soviet Union, he suddenly became very paranoid about Ukraine. And as I explain this moment in the book, and I also explain why just at that moment, he began talking about Ukraine from a decade earlier. He began talking about the Civil War. He talked about the moment when the Ukrainians had fought, some with the Poles, some with others, against the Soviet regime, had refused to accept the Bolshevik rule with any ease, had fought against the Red Army, and he became paranoid and obsessive about Ukraine, and he began sending messages to his colleagues about, what's going on in Ukraine. The Ukrainian Communist Party is refusing to collect grain. Things are going badly in Ukraine. We might lose Ukraine. Right at that moment, in the autumn of 1932, the Soviet Politburo passed a series of resolutions affecting mostly Ukraine. And these resolutions blacklisted Ukrainian towns and villages. They drew a cordon around the Republic of Ukraine so that people couldn't leave. They set up blockades between the countryside and the city. And they also activated a process whereby search teams began going into Ukrainian villages and taking food, not just grain, but in some cases, everything. Meat, beans, peas, corn, sometimes household pets, whatever it was that people had was removed from their homes. The effect of this was one of the most terrible famines that there's probably ever been in European history. The famine affected all of the Soviet Union. The chaos from collectivization had effects in Russia. There was a particularly strong famine in Kazakhstan as well for other reasons, but there was a very, very harsh famine in Ukraine. And the numbers until recently were disputed. Now demographers have been through the archives, and the number that people are happiest with is 3.9 or 4 million people.
The population at the time was about.
It's
hard to know.
It came to about 15% of the population, but in rural districts, and in some rural districts, it was as much as 50 or 60%. So the effect on Ukraine was to bring an end to all forms of resistance and to pacify the peasantry in a way that then lasted for several more decades. The Ukrainian famine went on to have, as some of you will know, went on to have a longer-term effect in Ukraine. It became because one of the first things that the Soviet Union did was to suppress all knowledge of it. At the time and afterwards, it was never mentioned, it was never discussed. A census that was taken in 1937, which showed the effect of the famine, was repressed. And the famine kind of went underground, and it became part of something like an alternative history. It was something that Ukrainians told one another. People learned it from their grandparents. They exchanged information about it, but it was never discussed in public. It was not until the late 1980s and early 1990s when the Soviet Union began to break up that it became a subject again. I decided to write about it. We were just talking just beforehand, because I became aware 4 or 5 years ago of the amount of new material and the amount of archival material that's now available about the famine. And I felt that this was the time to write it. Lots of people have said to me, well, this must be because of 2014 and so on. Actually, no. I started this before the invasion of Ukraine in 2014. But believe me, the fact that I was working on this book did make me more interested in that invasion. And I've remained very involved in this subject ever since.
Well, we'll come to that, and I hope in the course of the conversation that actually the coincidence, as you say, it is a coincidence of looking at what happened in 32 and 33, and yet how real and the reverberations are today is very much part of why, if you are interested in what's happening today, you ought to read this book. Because it's not just a natural occurrence, and it's not just a system that is engaged in through collectivization in the results of the famine, but there's a person behind it, as you argue in the book, and that Stalin, as a leader, actually deliberately went about creating the circumstances that made it worse. Talk a little bit about that. There is no direct evidence. As you note in the book, there's no one document that says, let's go out and create a famine, but talk about how he systematically and purposefully led to the kinds of policies that created this situation.
I hinted at it already. I mean, as I said, the turning point is this moment when he becomes paranoid about Ukraine. And actually, it was funny, when I was writing this book, I started off thinking, some of you may know my previous books were very complicated. They went over many years. I wrote a book about the Sovietization of Eastern Europe, and that was 3 countries, 2 decades, very complicated to do narratively. And when I started out with the Ukrainian famine, I thought, well, okay, 2 years, 1 country, how hard is that? But actually, as I began working on the famine, and as I began reading the documents, most of which had been dug up by Ukrainian historians over the last decade, And I saw how Stalin kept referring to the past, and he kept talking about the Civil War era in Ukraine. I had this moment of, this kind of sinking feeling, and I thought, oh God, I have to write about the Civil War. And I did go back, and the first part of the book is, it gives you, I think, it's a kind of fast introduction to Ukrainian history, because I talk about what happened in 1917, when there was, we all know there was one revolution. Actually, there were two revolutions in Russia. As you know, there was one in February when the Tsar resigned, and then there was a Bolshevik coup in October. But there was also in that year a revolution in Ukraine. And there was a very brief, short-lived Ukrainian national government which sought to create an independent Ukrainian state. And it very much saw itself along the lines of the Polish state that was recreated at that time, and the Baltic states that were recreated, and it saw that, on the ashes of the Imperial Russia, that they could have their own society. Almost from the beginning, the Bolsheviks were, implacably against the idea of an independent Ukraine. Lenin couldn't stand the idea that Ukrainian grain wouldn't belong to Russia. Stalin hated the idea that there would be any kind of competitor for Bolshevism. He saw Ukrainian nationalism, the language of the time was, bourgeois, white army, backwards looking, but in essence, what he disliked was any kind of political competition. And he, although the Ukrainian movement splintered during the Civil War, the Civil War in Ukraine was very chaotic, and by 1920, the Bolsheviks were in control again, they never quite forgot this moment of chaos when the Ukrainians had fought back against them. In particular, this peasant uprising, which had been very violent. And so Stalin begins to become, as the collectivization begins to go wrong, and he begins looking for scapegoats, and he begins, worrying about which enemies are going to overthrow him, he once again focuses on Ukraine. And so, as you say, no, there isn't a moment where he says, let's kill all the Ukrainians. There's no Wannsee conference movement. But there is, as I said, a series of decisions taken over several months that are targeted at Ukraine and that result in the spring of 1933, this huge peak in the Ukrainian death rate, which is traceable to these decisions taken in November and December.
And those death rates are different in other parts of the Soviet Union.
And they're different in other parts of the Union. They're higher in Ukraine. Another important point, though, is that in the wake of that decision, in a way, his second wave of attack on Ukraine is then it's followed by a mass arrest of Ukrainian intellectuals, artists, writers, really everybody, museum curators, anybody, and particularly anybody associated with that short-lived moment of Ukrainian independence. So he remains obsessed with the 1917-18 Ukrainian state, and he seeks to go back and erase any traces of it. And the goal really is to eliminate the possibility of Ukraine, again, as a competitor for Bolshevism. And again, we can talk about this later. I think this, the paranoia that Ukraine, it's important actually to remember that Stalin always saw Ukraine as kind of a domestic issue. It wasn't something that was happening, whenever there were problems in Kiev or there were problems, he didn't think of it he thought of it as something that could affect Moscow. There could be repercussions at home. What happens in Ukraine affects us. And I think that is something that Russians have to this day.
Well, part of it is the idea that there is a Ukrainian nationalism, and one of the things I want to talk to you about is and help us understand how the famine helps that. From Moscow's perspective, Ukraine doesn't exist. It's part of the argument we've heard for 300 years, and we're hearing even today. There's this famous quip that Putin telling George Bush, well, George, you don't understand, but Ukraine's not even a state. This idea, even though it was at that point an independent state, that it isn't, that it's part of Russia, leads to the consequence that actually the Ukrainians themselves are saying, well, wait a minute, we're not Russian, we're Ukrainian.
It's complicated.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it gets to the 14.
The parallel that I think helps people understand it, and forgive me, I'm biased, I live in London at the moment, and so I'm always looking for ways to explain this to the British, but The parallel that is actually quite useful is Britain and Ireland. So until the late 19th century, the British assumed that Ireland was just part of the British Isles. It was the same country, it wasn't different, they all spoke English. Okay, there were a few people around still speaking Irish or something else, but there's really no difference between. And the idea that Ireland might be independent or it might have its own country seemed to a lot of people, if you read what the British were saying, government was saying in the early part of the 20th century, like ridiculous. I mean, how can these peasants have their own country? How can they have their own culture? And it really took the Irish Rebellion, and it really took 50 years of independence before you had a clear sense in London that Dublin is a different country. And you have something like that with Ukraine, and that Ukraine was the history is very complicated. Ukraine has been part of different empires, and they're different, as is the case with many European states, there are different parts of Ukraine, and they have slightly different histories. But overall, the Russians historically saw Ukraine somewhat the way the British saw the Irish, as it's not quite the same as us. Okay, the language is different. We don't understand it. The culture seems different. Then Russian travelers in the 19th century often spoke about how Ukraine looks different to them, and the atmosphere is different, and the religion is different, and so on. But they nevertheless refused to see it as a foreign country. And the evolution of a Ukrainian sense of identity is also very complicated, because for many Ukrainians, this was true in the 19th century, and then of course it became true in the Soviet Union as well, if you wanted to get ahead in life, you learned Russian. Mm-hmm. And so Russian became the language for ambitious Ukrainians if you wanted to join the government or you wanted to have a high position in the economy, that was the way ahead. And Ukrainian became a kind of backwater. And in fact, for a long time, somebody telling you that you were Ukrainian, if you were inside the Soviet Union, was a way of, it identified you maybe as, a peasant or locally interested, somebody, it had a negative connotation. The change that's happened in Ukraine over the last 2 decades is therefore, it's to some people it feels very slow. Ukraine never is evolving fast enough. People, on the other hand, it's a place that hasn't had its own state. It didn't have its own. Ukrainianness didn't have a way to promote itself anywhere ever really, other than here actually. Chicago.
Here in Chicago, yeah.
And Toronto, in Canada. But inside Ukraine, you couldn't do it, and so, or not easily, or only in a very artificial way. And so what we've seen over the last couple of decades is the evolution of a much more self-confident, and people are looking now for new ways to define Ukrainianness, in a new world. But it is there's certainly a different language, and this I can tell you because I speak Russian and find Ukrainian frustratingly difficult. I can understand it if I try hard, and I can read it if I try hard, but it's not the same language at all. And if I do understand, I should say it's also partly because I also speak Polish. And there's influence of both Russian and Polish you can hear in Ukrainian. And there's a different sense of place and a different sense of geography also. The Ukrainians, Ukraine feels connected to Europe in different ways. It doesn't have that huge Eurasian hinterland. It's got a different sense of itself. And so the understanding that it's a foreign country has taken Russians longer, but it's also taken some Ukrainians a while too. But I think we're getting there.
So interestingly enough, you write about how the famine in modern Ukraine has become, in some case, a political football, with, on the one hand, a desire to point out that the famine existed and opening up under the regime of Yushchenko, but then under Yanukovych it was a little different.
Well, because the famine was repressed, and because it became part of this kind of alternative history, the private history that people talked about in their houses, the famine very much became, a story that people had that, in contrast to the lies that were told by the regime. And therefore it had a special role in the mentality of Ukrainians during Soviet times. It's very interesting that the first public mentions of the famine, the first time it ever was discussed in public, in the Soviet Union was right after the Chernobyl disaster. And this was not a disaster. If you remember what happened at Chernobyl, there was a catastrophe, the plant blew up, and then for 3 weeks, nobody in the Soviet government mentioned it. A May Day parade was allowed to go ahead. People were marching on the streets in Kiev, but nobody either in Ukraine or in Belarus were warned of anything that was going on. And it was only after that, when there were simply too many rumors and too much evidence from the West, and too many people became aware of what was happening, that Gorbachev finally came out and announced there had been this disaster. And to a lot of Ukrainians, this rang a kind of bell. And a famous Ukrainian literary figure, Ivan Drach, was the first to make this open comparison. Secrecy is bad for Ukrainians. We kept this story secret, just like the famine was kept secret 60 years ago. And so the discussion of the famine begins right at that moment, at the end of the Soviet Union, and is tied up from the beginning in the conversation about Ukrainian independence. Why do we need independence? Why is our history different from Russian history? What is it that we're rejecting about the Soviet Union? We're rejecting the totalitarian way of thinking that led to the famine. And so it became connected to the drive for independence. And actually all of the first Ukrainian presidents made a point of marking the famine, holding anniversaries. But in particular, after the Orange Revolution in 2004, the first Ukrainian president who had no connection to the Communist Party, which was Yushchenko, whose wife is also from Chicago. The first Ukrainian brought the famine to the forefront of his. It was part of his, his historical politics, if you would say, and this almost immediately hit up against a lot of Russian objections, and his successor, Viktor Yanukovych, who was the pro-Russian president of Ukraine, pushed back and shaped the argument a little bit differently. Although it's important to note that Yanukovych actually never did what Putin himself did, was he never cut off the archives, he never stopped research. Research into the famine and the accounting of the famine continued actually all through, even during his reign, and it's and much of the material is available now.
So let's take it to today, where we are, and let me start with Putin, not his relationship to Ukraine, but his relationship to the Soviet past, and in particular, the question of how he himself has dealt with this issue, and particularly with the crimes of Stalin, and how he talks about it, or in fact does not talk about it. How do we look at this?
Putin and Russia have undergone an evolution. When I was working in Russia, I worked in the Russian archives in the 1990s when I was writing my first history book, which was a history of the Gulag. And at that time, the attitude to the past was something like, I almost had this, I would tell people in Russia what I was doing, and some people were a little bit perplexed, like, why are you interested in this? That was a long time ago, it's not relevant, so many things are happening now, the history is over, and there was this kind of desire to move on. It wasn't negative, it wasn't, we need to repress this. But there was really no historical politics in the 1990s. Nobody was trying to use history to make political points. And one of the things that Putin did when he came to power, not immediately, but over time, was he repoliticized history in Russia. And he brought back the idea that events in the past justify, or legitimize the current Russian regime in the present, which is, of course, was a very Stalinist idea. All through the Soviet Union, history was made part of contemporary political arguments, often a very falsified and kind of brittle form. And Putin made some very deliberate decisions. He decided that the piece of history he wanted to remember was not, interestingly, the Russian Revolution, which I think actually we're talking about more in the West this year on the 100th anniversary than the Russians are. But it was 1945. And this is when Stalin was at his most kind of, he defeated the Germans, he occupied half of Europe, He was the triumphant figure in European history, and this moment of kind of imperial overstretch or imperial domination. This is what Putin has wanted to remember, and the event that he celebrates every year is May the 8th, which is the end of the war day. Every year now there's a big parade in Moscow. Soldiers dress up in Soviet uniforms, they wave Soviet flags, and this is the moment of celebration. And this, of course, is a deliberate choice. Opening at the
Sochi.
Exactly. He wants
Olympics
to bring the idea is to bring back an idea of empire, and to bring back an idea of imperial grandeur. And this is a calculated choice. That this is something that will give Russians some feeling of pride. It will give him legitimacy as a new imperial leader of a new Russia. It's a sad thing in my view, because there are other great moments in Russian history that he could have chosen, and there are other heroes that he could have. I mean, for example, it's my view that the Russian human rights movement in the 1960s and 70s really invented the modern idea of human rights. I mean, it's a longer conversation, maybe not for tonight, but they were, it was a very original and creative, and one could decide that that's the founding moment. That's the exciting thing to look back to. Or he could pick some of the great Russian liberals, in the period just before the revolution, and choose them as heroes. But he's chosen as his heroic moment, 1945, and all kinds of other things flow from that. And the control now, the control over the history narrative in Russia is very careful and deliberate. As I said, the revolution is not mentioned. Crimes of Stalin are not denied. There's no politics of disappearance, of zero memory like there used to be, but they're certainly not marked. They're not commemorated. They're not an important part of any national narrative. And although there was a moment in the 1990s and earlier, but even a little bit later, when some Gulag survivors and other, actually Solzhenitsyn himself actually for a while, became important public figures in Russia, that's mostly over. And the people who I knew who helped me write my earlier books in the 1990s are mostly not public figures anymore. They don't have much of a role. Nobody consults them. They don't speak anywhere. They aren't celebrated. So the choice has been not to erase the Stalinist past, but to de-emphasize it. And the Ukrainian famine, and actually the Soviet famine, doesn't exist at all as a theme in modern Russia.
So to what extent can that explanation of how Putin looks at history and the choices he made about 45 versus 17 or the 60s and 70s, how is that part of the explanation what happened in late 2013, early 2014 with regard to Ukraine? What's the strategic, assuming there is a strategic element? But
I think there is a strategy. Yeah. It's complicated because I think actually Putin had a different strategy for Ukraine and that failed, but that's what happened in 2014 was something actually quite monumental, and that was the Ukrainian Revolution. And as I've imagine if for Stalin this idea of the Ukrainian Revolution caused paranoia, imagine how odd it is. 80 years later, another Ukrainian revolution sparks a similar kind of paranoia. It's not exactly the same. What did Putin see when he saw young people on the Maidan, waving European flags and calling for an anti-corruption movement, and calling for democracy and calling for rule of law? What he saw was a movement that could spread to Russia, and the immediate paranoia was, this is something that needs to be stopped immediately because this could affect me. And in the same way that Stalin always saw Ukrainian issues as being domestic Russian issues, I think Putin saw Ukraine very much as an internal problem. And the reason for the he almost overdid his reaction. I mean, his this quick, fast invasion of Crimea and then the invasion of eastern Ukraine was, I think, based on this fear that the movement would spread to Russia. And so that, I think, is part of it. I think he also had a misunderstanding of Ukraine in that he thought that because Ukraine is a bilingual country, in which really everybody speaks both Ukrainian and Russian. I've been to public meetings in Kiev where people switch from one language to the other, and sometimes even in the same sentence. And nobody really cares or pays any attention except poor me, who doesn't really speak good Ukrainian. So I have to elbow people and get them to explain what just happened. But he made the assumption that because some Ukrainians speak Russian, that means they're all Russians. And I think he expected, particularly after the successful invasion of Crimea, which was successful mostly because it was so rapid and unexpected, he expected the invasion of eastern Ukraine would be equally successful, and he didn't expect any kind of pushback. And the original idea, if you remember, was Novorossiya, that there was going to be a kind of Eastern Ukrainian state that would be pro-Russian, Russian-speaking, and might eventually be annexed by Russia, just like Crimea. And I think that was his original idea. And as I think your question implied, that was also an imperial idea. We're going to put together the Russian Empire once again. We're going to take it back piece by piece. And all the propaganda around Crimea, and as some of you will remember who know the story, there was a kind of Krim Nash movement, our Crimea, memes and chants and songs, and it was all built up as a kind of imperial moment of great imperial triumph. I mean, we're taking back. This is the beginning of a new Russian Empire, and it's happening again. I actually think, and this is maybe off the subject, I think the problem with that movement was, particularly after the things in eastern Ukraine didn't go so well, is that he began to fear. He began to fear that this wasn't exciting enough. Interest in Ukraine was dropping off in Russia. People felt pretty ambivalent about the idea of sending Russian troops into Ukraine. And I think the invasion of Syria, partly, Putin's intervention in Syria rather, was partly an attempt to rekindle that imperial spirit somewhere else in the Middle East, and to find a new set of enemies. I mean, the Ukrainians were running; they weren't quite as useful as enemies after a year or two, and so let's have Islamic State as enemies now. But I think very much the idea that Putin is now, legitimizes himself as, very openly and in much of his language, as somebody who's bringing back imperial glory. He's putting Russia on the world stage again. He's made Russia into a world power again, and that's why people should support him.
So imperial in some ways. I mean, I think I agree with you that because Ukraine didn't go as well as he thought, that Syria might be the next way in which to demonstrate Russian power. What was striking in 2014 was this language that Moscow has the right and the duty to defend Russians no matter where they are, Russian-speaking people, which some communities in Tel Aviv and Brighton Beach might not have taken as kindly to.
It's funny, I have a friend who has a Russian wife and lives in Washington. And he said, "What? So well, you're coming here?" So,
but that seems to have disappeared, or at least been downplayed vis-a-vis the imperial.
Well, it's very complicated because not everybody in Russia speaks Russian.
Well, so that's a problem.
And Russia itself is a multinational state.
Of course.
And so it's a complicated argument for Russians to make, and that was why, prior to that, as you remember, he had this vision of Eurasia, that Russia was going to be the leader of Eurasia. And that's never quite gone all that well either. But there have been these two different models of what the new empire is going to look like. But yes, the justification for the invasion of Ukraine was very much, yes, we're bringing Russians back into the fold and rebuilding the Russian Empire.
So before I open up and so think about your questions, and for those of you can vote on questions, as some have already done that are online. The pushback in some ways that we saw by Ukrainians first and foremost, secondly by the sanctions that it came from in Europe and the United States, and sort of thwarted Putin. To what extent is that reality responsible for what Putin then decided to do in the 2016 election here in the United States? Is there a relationship between what was happening in Ukraine and his desire, clearly, at the very least, as the intelligence community said, to interfere in our election in order to prevent Hillary Clinton from winning, quite apart from what he may have done on helping Donald Trump from winning. Should we look at this in that relationship,
So I think
differently?
The Russian interest in meddling in the electoral systems and in the politics, firstly of its neighbors, including Ukraine, but also, Moldova, Georgia, the Baltic states, Central Europe. The Russian interest in intervention goes back before that. And the beginnings of what has become this really extraordinary new form of, I don't actually like the expression information war, but I haven't been able to think of a better sort of disinformation campaigns. The use of those tactics actually now it goes back several years. Some of them were first tried in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Some of them have been tried in the Baltic states and Central Europe. Some of them have been tried in other European countries. The fact that they were tried, and it's funny because I was aware of and I began writing about, how particularly this Russian use of Facebook, Twitter, and other forms of social media they really were the first to see that these new forms of communication allowed them a way to intervene in politics that they hadn't had before. And then, of course, now everybody's figured it out. The Chinese will figure it out. Lots of nice Americans will figure it out too, and have done. But they were the first to understand how to use this as tools of manipulation, how to create fake websites, how to create systems of fake websites that backed one another up so that you could get one and it would be quoting another, and also how to use, by the way, hacked and leaked material in order to create online hysteria and election hysteria. And we saw them do that. There were multiple European elections in several countries where very similar tactics were used. It's funny for me because I started writing about this a couple of years earlier, and I wrote a big paper on it with a colleague, Edward Lucas, that was published in Washington in 2015. And when I saw some of this starting in the United States in 2016, I could sort of see it online, and my first reaction was, oh, well, this, it's ridiculous. It can't have any impact in the United States. It's, too big a country, and I had all kinds of reasons why I thought it wouldn't work. It's been, I don't think we want to get into the argument over exactly how successful it was, but I had underestimated the degree to which any electoral system is vulnerable to these kinds of tactics and these kinds of techniques. But anyway, the short answer to your question is no, I don't think it was a response to 2014. I think it was something they'd been working on long before. They certainly began attacking Hillary Clinton online, when she was Secretary of State, so that dates way back before the invasion of Ukraine. And I think this is a long-term, think of it as a cheap way for a former superpower to begin to have political influence again. And they saw this actually almost a decade ago, and they began working on it and playing with it and trying to understand it ever since then.
So more part of the imperial strategy in some ways.
I think it's part of the imperial strategy and also part of the how they hope to undermine not so much individual countries, but Western institutions, NATO, the European Union. All these institutions are a problem for them because, by itself, there is no single European country that Russia can't at least be an equal to. So, Germany, at least one-on-one, they're equals. They speak equally. And most European nations are much smaller than Russia, mm-hmm. and are easily bullied or intimidated. But as a whole, as a group, the EU can push back against Russia. It can push back against, oil and gas monopolies. It can impose antitrust rules and so on. And it could, in theory at least, if it wanted to, push back against Russian corruption. And that's what Russia is afraid of. And so Russia sees it as its interest to undo the EU, to undo NATO, in order to have these bilateral relationships that it prefers.
Great. Let's open up. I'm going to start because it follows really nicely with the top question here, which is to think about.
I want to know, how are people voting on these questions? That's so cool.
You can do it online. So you go on to and for those who have not gone online, chi whatever it is, inf.io. That's how you get online. That's how you ask questions and vote for them. The question is, can you envision a scenario where Ukraine joins NATO? Let me broaden that. That is,
isn't this your subject?
Yeah. So so I know what the answer. I know what my answer is, but I think the real issue is the question of where the future of Ukraine lies. Ukraine has been divided on this issue. Do we go for the West? Do we go for Russia? When I was last in Ukraine, which was in early 2015, what was so remarkable was how more Ukrainian Ukraine had become. And the idea of Ukraine wanting to be part of the Western group had penetrated well beyond Kiev, further and further east. And the sense that a big change had happened.
So there is a remarkable change in Ukraine, and I'm afraid it is partly to do with the war.
Yeah.
I have a friend one of the women who helped me do some research for my book, and who described to me at one point how her husband, who'd never really bothered to think about what nationality he was or where his allegiances lay, who's a Ukrainian who lived in Kiev, who'd grown up speaking Russian at home, which, as I said, is very normal. Many people who identify as Ukrainian speak Russian. And he made a decision after the invasion of Ukraine. He made a decision consciously to switch languages. Okay, now I'm going to speak Ukrainian, even though that's not, in a way, his native language. It's not the language he grew up speaking. And I think that's a lot of people made that decision, and it has had the invasion has had the effect of consolidating Ukrainianness. I mean, it hasn't fixed everything. Let's stipulate, but it has consolidated Ukraine in a way that it hasn't. Ukraine joining NATO is complicated because I think NATO is not in an expansionary mode right now, and I don't see lots of people joining NATO right now. NATO is partly because of the nature of the current American president, who has been throughout actually his life, for a decade, has been publicly skeptical of NATO, and partly because of uncertainty in a lot of current NATO members. I don't see it as in an expansionary mode at all. It's very much right now about coalescing, about making sure its borders are guarded, about getting some troops into the Baltic states and thinking along those lines. So I don't see that happening right now, and I think right now it depends a lot more on on that than on anything Ukraine's doing. I mean, I'm sure there is now there's beginning to be momentum, and I haven't seen recent statistics, majority for Ukraine being as much part of European institutions as it's possible to be. Unfortunately, Ukraine's timing is not good, and this is not there aren't Western institutions are not expanding right now. But I do think I think Ukraine will come closer to the West in a lot of ways, though.
Let me open up and go around the room. We'll start right here in just on the gentleman in the blue shirt. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Very good talk. A comment and then the question. The comment
Especially the question. Especially the question.
Especially the question. Yeah. Very quickly, is you keep assuming that the current occupant of the White House is rational in making decisions. He isn't. He doesn't.
Did I say that?
Yeah. Yeah, you said that he doesn't like NATO. Anyway, the question is there any connection, either politically or meteorologically or in some other way, between the Ukrainian famine and the Dust Bowl in the United States?
No. The Ukrainian famine, I mean, again, the famine had multiple causes, but the Ukrainian famine was an artificial famine. So it had nothing to do with the weather. It was caused by chaos of collectivization, and it was caused by Stalin's policy of requisitioning grain from the peasants and forcing them to get, people were starving because their food was taken away. And in Ukraine, that was made even worse by a policy of taking away not just grain, but everything. I mean, literally teams of people went from house to house and confiscated food. And they confiscated corn and beets and squash and whatever people had in their cupboards and whatever people had hidden in their gardens and whatever people had managed to keep. And people were reduced to eating rats and frogs and it had nothing to do with weather. And so it was, in that sense, an artificial famine. It was a created famine.
We'll go right here on the side, the lady, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Maybe you can comment on something that always fascinated me. How in the 1930s, Stalin was able to suppress all and any information about the famine to go out into the world. I understand internally the fear that people had and they couldn't talk about it. But how is it that no one in the world out there was speaking about it, and even the New York Times, when presented with information, refused to write about it? And also, if you could comment on similarities between the tactics used then for disinformation, suppressing information, and spreading false information, and what is being done now by Putin, with the difference that we have technology, and he can use technology for that, but those tactics were used then as well.
So yes, it's not an accident that I have written 3 books now about the Soviet Union, and I'm now working on this project to do with disinformation at the LSE. It's in my head, believe me, they're connected. So the question about journalists and how the famine was suppressed. First of all, you'll be delighted to know there's a chapter on it in my book, so you can read up on it. It's a complicated question. It's one of these questions about what people know and what they don't know, because of course some news of the famine did get out. Ukrainians in neighboring states, in Poland and elsewhere, and even the Ukrainians here and in the diaspora in Canada were aware of the famine and wrote letters about it. The Foreign Office knew about the famine. I've read through some of the Foreign Office documents. There were diplomatic reports on the famine. But somehow it never rose to the level of being public discussion or crisis. And you're right to point to one of the issues was how journalists were writing about it. This is an era when journalists who were based in Moscow had were unable to send any information outside of the country that didn't go through censors. So everything they wrote was censored. They all understood that a mention of the famine, first of all, might not make it into their copy, and second of all, if they managed to get it out somehow, which some people did try to do, they were at risk of losing their jobs and being kicked out of the country. I mean, it's hard to think back to an era when it was that easy to control, what news came in and what got out. But it could be done. I mean, the New York Times reporter you're referring to is Walter Duranty. Again, extensively described in the book, and actually an excerpt from that chap was just published in The Atlantic a few days ago from my description of him. He's a very complicated figure. He liked his job in Moscow. He liked being the most important and most famous correspondent in Moscow. He was quite a hero in New York. He was a very well-known figure. Roosevelt demanded to see him and meet with him. He was feted at dinners and parties. It wasn't in his interest to mess up his relationship with the USSR, even though, by the way, he was not a communist or even particularly left-wing. But he had the position of, I'm very rational, I'm very cold-blooded, I'm judging this regime I'm trying to be neutral. And that made him particularly useful to the regime because he wasn't seen as a kind of left-wing spokesman for it. And it was almost his vanity that persuaded him to write the way he did. That he knew about the famine, that he understood that people were starving is almost without question. There's actually there's again a Foreign Office, British Foreign Office document that describes one of the diplomats describes a conversation he's just had with Walter Duranty. This is in the British in British archives, in which he said, yes, Mr. Duranty knows about the famine, but he hasn't yet decided to share that with his American readers. So, it was known but not discussed. There were a few very brave and very interesting attempts to write about it. The most famous one was a Welsh journalist named Gareth Jones, who, at the height of the famine in 1933, got himself as a kind of freelancer to Moscow, got on a train from Moscow to Kharkiv, got off the train about halfway, and started walking down the train tracks. This is in Stalin's Soviet Union. At a moment of terrible starvation, took careful notes about what he saw, and then eventually left the country, wrote about it, actually held a press conference in Berlin describing the Ukrainian famine, published several articles. But it's a question of, he was in his 20s, he wasn't famous, he wasn't writing for the New York Times, and his work somehow never got the notice at the time or later that others did. So there was information, but it somehow never rose to the highest levels. It's a very interesting story about what we know and what we don't know. I mean, things were known. If you'd wanted to know, you could have known, but it just wasn't. It didn't reach that level of popular knowledge.
We get another question from online here. It says whether you think it's possible that Ukraine would separate into two separate states. Let's put it this way. Was it more possible before the invasion than after the invasion, or how do you see the state as such?
The idea that Ukraine is somehow, there's a Russian bit and a Ukrainian bit, and that you could draw a line through it, and that would, give you, is actually a myth. And I think it's a myth that's particularly strong in Anglo-Saxon countries, where the only language we speak here is English. And the idea that you can have a bilingual country, which you do in other places, you do in Belgium, there are other, you can think of other bilingual countries, is so impossible to understand that people keep wanting to draw a line and, redo the map, to have it make sense in our terms, because we don't have this bilingual tradition. So no, I think even before 2014, the idea that there was a place where you could draw the line and people would have been happy to split and go on one side or the other was always a myth. This is what Putin believed, I think. I mean, I think this was he believed that, remember that the invasion of, when they invaded Donetsk, they also tried to carry out these little mini coup d'etat in several other Ukrainian cities, including Kharkiv and Odessa. And they were very surprised when people fought back and when those failed. Because again, Putin had this idea, if you speak Russian, you must be Russian. And the idea that you were a Russian-speaking Ukrainian, or anywhere you were a Russian speaker who lived in Odessa who did not want to be ruled by Putin's Russia, came as a surprise. So no, I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, I think that was Putin's idea, and it was a misunderstanding of what Ukraine is, and it was a big miscalculation. No, I don't see that happening now.
Great. The gentleman right here up front.
How much influence does the Russian Orthodox Church have in Ukraine?
I'm not really the best person to answer that question, because I don't have, I'm not sure I have and I'm even guessing there are probably people in the room who could answer it better than me. I don't have a strong finger on the pulse, but my instinct is probably not that much. The Russian Orthodox Church is very much associated with the Russian state, and with, and it's very hard to dissociate it from the Russian state. And as a result of that, Ukraine has developed other kinds of Orthodox churches. I mean, as you probably know, there are multiple churches in Ukraine. First, there are Ukrainian Catholics. There are also Ukrainian Greek Catholics. There are Roman Catholics and Greek Catholics, which is a unique form of Catholicism that dates back to an era when Ukraine was, that part of Ukraine was part of the Polish Empire. And there are also Ukrainian Orthodox who are, loyal to a Ukrainian hierarchy, who are not part of the Russian church. I mean, they're members, of course, of the Russian church as well. But it doesn't have there's no unified church, and the Russian church is just one of several in Ukraine that operate there.
Adele Simmons, just hang on for the mic, please.
You talked about the Russians meddling in elections, both in the Ukraine, and then you also mentioned the U.S. What can we do to stop that?
Well,
Next book.
no. So, part of what the Russians do is they take advantage of existing problems. So what they do in Europe, for example, for many years, is they back far right and far left parties. And these aren't parties they invent. They did not invent Marine Le Pen's National Front. That's been a part of French politics for many years. What they did was they funded it. And so, decent laws on funding political parties would have eliminated their. So some of what some of what is necessary to stop the Russian impacting our politics would be is really to do with our politics. How do we make our own politics less divided? Why are we why is it so easy to turn Americans against one another? How come that turned out to be so easy to do in fairly simple online ways? So that's part of the answer, is something deeper about U.S. politics and also the politics of every particular country in which the interventions happened. So I don't want to say that it's the divisions that they help create aren't some of the solutions have nothing to do with Russia. There is a separate question about social media and how advertising is done on social media, how easy it is to fake identities on social media, that I think is going to have to be answered firstly by the tech companies. And if it's not answered by the tech companies, I think that regulators will begin dealing with it. I mean, that I think is beginning to happen in Europe. Maybe it's coming here as well. So no, it shouldn't be possible for botnets founded and paid for and organized in Russia to be actively tweeting and attempting to manipulate what Americans see on Facebook or Twitter here. And you could, in some cases, on Twitter, for example, you could eliminate anonymous accounts very easily if Twitter wanted to do that. The way in which advertising works on Facebook, was particularly conducive to divisive advertising and so on. So some of it will have to do, we need to look very carefully at how social media works and how it's dividing people and how people are responding to it. And there may be some answers in there as well. Some fairly simple things also, like, applying the electoral laws that already apply to regular media, applying them to social media would also help. So, okay, it's illegal for foreigners to buy election ads, in newspapers. Why isn't it illegal for them to do it on Facebook? I mean, and some of the, applying existing law, I think, would make a big difference. And that's the beginning of there's a longer answer to that too, but we'll have,
We can stay here for many hours, to talk
right.
about that and all the other issues that have been raised, but we are unfortunately out of time. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you in the top question that everybody seems to want to know, which is whether Donald Trump is colluding with Vladimir Putin. And because we're running out of time, you can just do a yes or no answer. Or not.
I don't think they're in constant touch. I don't imagine that there's a hotline to the Kremlin. I don't have that kind of conspiratorial imagination. Does Trump have a special set of feelings about Russia? Were there links between his campaign and the Russian attempt to affect our election? Yes, I think there probably were.
Well, with that, please join me in thanking Anne for a terrific conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Books are available.